you mentioned baptism, and I know we're going to kind of get into that later, but just because you brought it in the context of the message of the gospel itself, where you said, you quoted First Corinthians chapter 1, where Apostle Paul is saying that the message, he was not sent to baptize, but to preach the gospel. So the baptism is excluded from the gospel. It's not part of the gospel. It doesn't mean that it's not good. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Obviously, we're going to talk about that later. But what it means is that it's not part of the gospel message. And so that's pretty curious, because when you think about it, I'm trying to think of the way the World Mission Society Church of God members are going to think. And I'm trying to cut off all the ways to try to get around this, because when you're in a cult and when someone's challenging you and there's no way out, you try to fall back on any little excuse that you can, other than to just be humble and accept the fact that you could be wrong and that you need to take a serious look at the scriptures. Because, and you know, we're going to go back to 2 verses after this that are going to mention why it's scary, why it's important to make sure you have the correct gospel. But just going back to the whole baptism thing, I want members to think about this, because if you guys try to justify it by saying, well, maybe the message of the Passover is included in that, then let me ask you a question. In order to keep Passover according to your doctrine, what do you need to do first? You need to be baptized. And then once you're baptized, then you're allowed to keep the Passover. So if you're saying that Passover is part of that gospel message, then baptism should be part of that gospel message too, because you can't have one without the other, according to the World Mission Society Church of God. But according to Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he lays it out very clear. He was not sent to baptize, but to preach the gospel. So meaning there was people who were saved without being baptized. But if you guys are teaching that the gospel itself is Passover, well, how are they keeping Passover without being baptized? It doesn't make sense for Apostle Paul to say that. And not only that, he said, I think in verse 14, I thank God that I did not baptize any of you. If that's the gospel, let me baptize someone in order for them to keep the Passover. Again, like to Jordan's point, then Paul's just exposing himself as the most crooked apostle of them all, because he's trying to lead you away from salvation. If he's thanking God that he didn't baptize anyone, then they can't keep the Passover, then they can't be saved. But we understand that was a part of the gospel message.
Yep. Yeah, again, if the WMSCOG doctrine is true, then over and over again here, we're seeing that Paul is exposing himself as a false prophet, as preaching a false, at best, a grossly incomplete version of the gospel. But at the same time, it's not that he's like just accidentally forgetting or having some, purpose in not mentioning certain aspects of, the gospel, like baptism or Passover. It's like here, verse 14 of 1 Corinthians, he's thanking God that he purposely did not include these. It's like, so if the WMS is correct, we basically have Paul here saying, I thank God that I've been preaching a false gospel to you and manipulating you into not, knowing and understanding what really leads to the forgiveness of your sins. I'm thankful to God that I've, left you in the dark about what really needs to take place in order for you to be reconciled to God. If the WMS is correct in their doctrines, and this is a huge problem, a massive problem. And I think it'd be on the WMS to explain why is Paul saying these things? Why is he articulating the gospel in this way?
You know what would be funny is that Hebrew Israelites, what they do is, because Apostle Paul, a lot of Paul's letters contradict their teaching. What they do is they started to say that Apostle Paul went off, that Apostle Paul wasn't correct, and he went his own way. I wonder if the World Mission Society Church of God would go even
eventually.
lower. Yeah, eventually, and tweet. I'm saying it now. If they start telling you guys that Apostle Paul was losing his mind or don't listen to everything that Paul says, you heard it here first, because they can't make sense of the gospel that the apostles preached and line it up with what they teach. It's a total contradiction, night and day difference.
Yep.